May 1945.
Auszulesen in unseren Reihen.
Heinrich Himmler died by biting down on a cyanide capsule in a British cell. Just one day earlier, US troops had detained his wife Margarete and his daughter Gudrun near Bolzano. The world believed his legacy had died with him, but it was completely mistaken. The interrogations revealed that the Himmler family was hiding secrets that went far beyond what the Allies had imagined. For years, Himmler had maintained a second family with his lover, Hedwig Potthast. With her, he had 2 children who lived in a residence financed with SS funds and furnished with items confiscated from deported Jewish families. Margarete knew, but she never revealed it out of fear. Weeks before his capture, Heinrich had betrayed Hitler by negotiating surrender with the Allies, offering to release the Jewish prisoners he himself had condemned to death. For 73 years, Gudrun became the guardian of the networks her father had built. She traveled personally to Chile to meet Walter Rauff, financed Klaus Barbie's legal defense, and sent checks to Josef Mengele's family. The Allies interrogated Margarete and Gudrun for months, searching for the SS treasure, hidden accounts in Switzerland and Liechtenstein where Himmler had transferred fortunes confiscated from millions of victims. This documentary reveals how the heirs of Heinrich Himmler concealed for decades secrets and vendettas that would forever alter the history we thought we knew about the end of the Third Reich. The interrogations of the Reichsführer's family and his secret lover. In May 1945, Heinrich Himmler died in a British cell in Lüneburg after biting into a cyanide capsule he had concealed for 9 days in captivity. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, the exact location kept under absolute secrecy by British authorities to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for sympathizers of the fallen regime. Only 24 hours before his detention, US troops had arrested his wife Margarete and his daughter Gudrun near Bolzano as they attempted to cross into Italy, hoping to disappear amid the chaos of the war's final days. Gudrun was 16 years old. Within the SS, she was affectionately known as Püppi, a nickname reflecting her father's particular fondness for her and the privileged status she had enjoyed as the Reichsführer's daughter. She had grown up photographed beside him at official party events, educated in luxuriously appointed official residences, convinced from childhood that her surname represented unquestionable authority, iron discipline, and historic greatness destined to endure for 1,000 years. Within days, that entire universe collapsed. But there was another Himmler family the Allies did not yet know about. Since 1941, Heinrich had maintained a secret relationship with Hedwig Potthast, his personal secretary, a woman 26 years younger than Margarete. With her, he had 2 children, Helga, born in February 1942, and Nanette Dorothea, born in July 1944. Himmler installed Hedwig and the children in a spacious residence in Berchtesgaden, fully financed with institutional SS funds and furnished with high-quality items confiscated from Jewish families deported to camps in the East. Margarete was fully aware of this parallel family. Himmler had informed her directly in 1941, presenting it not as personal infidelity but as a higher racial duty, an exemplary personal contribution to the Lebensborn program, specifically designed to increase the Aryan population through selective and controlled procreation among members deemed racially valuable within the SS and other party organizations. Margarete had to accept it without any real possibility of protest. She had no practical alternative. Her social and economic position depended entirely on her husband, and the regime openly normalized de facto polygamy among the party's ruling elite as an ideologically legitimate and desirable practice. Margarete's humiliation was profound but necessarily silent. Personal letters preserved in German and American archives reveal her carefully contained resentment, expressed through oblique references to the other woman and veiled complaints about the excessive time Heinrich spent away from home under vague official justifications. Publicly, however, she maintained the impeccable facade of a loyal and understanding wife. Hedwig, by contrast, enjoyed an extraordinarily privileged position without any of the heavy protocol burdens Margarete was required to bear. She did not have to attend long official events or maintain demanding social appearances within party circles. She lived fully protected, enjoying remarkable material luxuries in the midst of total war, while millions of German civilians endured extreme rationing and increasingly harsh living conditions. When the regime finally collapsed in the final weeks of April and May 1945, Hedwig fled south with her 2 young children, following routes similar to those taken by Margarete and Gudrun, but deliberately remaining separate to avoid encounters. She was captured by US troops in June 1945 near the Italian border. It took Allied interrogators several weeks to fully understand that the relatively young woman with 2 small children was in fact the secret lover of the Reichsführer SS, and that her children were Gudrun's biological half-siblings. The interrogations of Margarete and Gudrun focused on locating incriminating documents, hidden accounts in Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and possible clandestine networks capable of reorganizing Nazi structures after defeat. Decades later, declassified documents made it possible to reconstruct the content of those sessions with considerable precision. Gudrun was questioned about the SS treasure, gold from confiscations, valuables, and missing foreign currency, and about possible resistance plans such as Werwolf, the alleged secret paramilitary organization intended to continue the war through guerrilla tactics and sabotage after formal military defeat. She was asked whether she knew anything about the escape network known as Odessa, which supposedly helped high-ranking Nazi officers systematically flee to South American countries through established clandestine routes and false documentation. She also denied having visited concentration camps alongside her father. However, SS photographic archives preserve images from a visit to Dachau in May 1941 in which she appears at his side during an official inspection. When asked to explain the Lebensborn program, she described it as a charitable institution for single mothers. She did not mention that she herself had been used as a propaganda image for the project. She likewise rejected the validity of testimonies from former prisoners and detained auxiliary personnel, claiming their statements had been obtained under pressure or through promises of judicial benefits. Among the testimonies already circulating in Allied files in 1945 were statements from survivors who would later testify in international trials, such as Rudolf Werber and Alfred Wetzler, who had documented the internal functioning of Auschwitz after their escape, as well as reports signed by detained former commanders such as Rudolf Höss. Gudrun maintained that such testimonies were part of a coordinated accusatory construction and denied their evidentiary value even when they aligned with seized German administrative documentation. That denial, fixed at 16 in the face of converging evidence, was not temporary. It became the enduring axis of her stance for the rest of her life. British reports from late 1945 described her as ideologically closed to any revision of what she had learned within her family environment. Margarete and Gudrun were released in November 1946 after being deemed to pose no operational risk. Hedwig Potthast had been released several months earlier in March 1946 along with her 2 children. The devastated world to which the 3 women returned bore no resemblance whatsoever to the privileged and seemingly stable world they had left behind barely 18 months earlier. Their main property in Gmund am Tegernsee had been officially confiscated by occupation authorities. Their personal and family bank accounts were completely frozen. That leads directly to the next chapter of this story. Margarete Himmler convicted as an active Nazi in the hidden negotiations with the Allies. Margarete's denazification file was officially reopened several times by specialized tribunals during the occupation years. In her first formal classification, issued in 1951, she was designated a Mitläuferin, a technical term used for passive followers or sympathizers without direct responsibility for specific crimes. But in January 1953, the British occupation authorities reviewed her full file and elevated her classification to Belastet, Category 2, a designation formally identifying her as a committed activist of the regime or someone who had substantially benefited from it. This reclassification was based on newly uncovered documentation, including official records of her active participation in the NS Frauenschaft, the Nazi Party's official women's organization, and personal correspondence showing not merely passive awareness of her husband's activities, but genuine and active ideological enthusiasm. She was formally sentenced to complete 30 days of compulsory special labor, permanently stripped of the right to vote in the new German democracy, and temporarily deprived of all state pension rights. For Margarete, these administrative measures were devastating, both materially and psychologically. She wrote multiple formal letters of protest addressed to various German and Allied authorities, Documents in which she consistently described herself as an innocent victim of an unjust and vindictive system, a simple wife and mother relentlessly persecuted by irrational hatreds she considered deeply unfounded. Yet there was something profoundly significant that Margarete never mentioned in any of her written protests of innocence: her direct and personal knowledge of the secret negotiations Heinrich had attempted to establish with Western Allied representatives during the final weeks of the war in April 1945. As the Third Reich collapsed irreversibly on both military and administrative fronts, Himmler opened a secret channel with Count Folke Bernadotte, a leader of the Swedish Red Cross with international diplomatic access. He conveyed a concrete proposal: a separate surrender of German forces on the Western Front to the British and Americans, bypassing Berlin. The objective was to halt the Allied advance in the West and concentrate the conflict against the Soviet Union, presenting it as a shared defense against communism. As part of the offer, Himmler proposed the release of Jewish prisoners still alive in camps within the Reich as a bargaining element. He sought to present himself to the Western powers as a pragmatic interlocutor willing to break with Hitler in order to preserve political leverage in the war's final outcome. Bernadotte, fully aware of the improbability that the offer would be accepted, nevertheless formally transmitted it to London and Washington through Swedish diplomatic channels. The response was unequivocal and arrived within hours: absolute rejection. The Allies would not negotiate partial surrenders under any circumstances. The principle of unconditional surrender established at the Casablanca Conference in 1943 was not open to debate. When Adolf Hitler learned of the negotiations through intelligence intercepts that were still partially functioning in the Reich's final days, he interpreted the act as unforgivable personal betrayal. In his political testament, dictated in the Chancellery bunker just hours before his suicide on April 30, 1945, Hitler formally expelled Himmler from the party in virulent language. "The traitor Himmler has negotiated with the enemy behind my back. His disloyalty stains all previous service." That posthumous expulsion was one of the Führer's final official acts. What Allied interrogators failed to establish with certainty for months was the precise extent of Margarete's and Gudrun's knowledge of these negotiations. Telephone records recovered from the SS communications offices in Berchtesgaden revealed that Himmler had made at least 3 calls to his family residence during the second half of April 1945. In one of them, partially transcribed by SS operators before files were destroyed, Himmler told Margarete that he was working on diplomatic channels to save German lives through neutral contacts. The language was deliberately ambiguous, but the timing aligned exactly with his secret meetings with Bernadotte. Gudrun, who often listened to her father's phone conversations when he called home, would have been present during at least one of these calls, according to notes in Margarete's personal diary recovered years later. Neither woman ever mentioned these conversations during their interrogations in 1945 and 1946. Revealing that Himmler had attempted to negotiate behind Hitler's back would have shattered the central narrative Gudrun constructed immediately and defended for the rest of her life. The image of her father as a loyal servant of the Reich to the very end, betrayed by circumstances but never a traitor himself. It would also have exposed the fundamental moral contradiction Gudrun was never able or willing to confront. Her father had attempted to purchase his own survival through the strategic release of prisoners he himself had condemned to extermination camps. For Margarete, admitting knowledge of the negotiations would have meant acknowledging that Heinrich had actively planned a future without Hitler, complicating her own narrative as an uninformed wife who merely followed her husband's lead. This deliberate omission during interrogations had lasting consequences. When documents concerning the Himmler-Bernadotte negotiations were partially declassified in the 1960s, Gudrun had already consolidated her position as a central figure in SS veterans' circles. Confronted by journalists on the subject in 1967, she responded with a phrase that would become characteristic of her rhetoric. "My father tried to save lives until the end. That is not betrayal. It is humanity." The statement completely ignored the fact that the lives he offered to save belonged to people his own system had previously condemned to death. During the 1950s, Gudrun struggled to adapt to a world that had changed radically. She worked intermittently in Munich, alternating modest jobs that stood in stark contrast to the absolute privilege she had enjoyed until the age of 16. In 1951, she married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz in a small, discreet ceremony attended mainly by former acquaintances from SS circles. Berwitz, an engineer by profession, shared Gudrun's far-right political inclinations and was an active member of the National Democratic Party, an organization that consistently attracted former Nazis and sympathizers of the fallen regime. The couple had 2 children during the 1950s, a son born in 1954 and a daughter in 1957. Both would grow up aware of their maternal grandfather's identity, but unlike their mother, they maintained no public profile, rejecting any visible association with the Himmler name. In 1952, Gudrun resumed systematic contact with networks of families of former SS members. These circles operated semi-clandestinely, organizing private gatherings in homes or in discreet restaurants on the outskirts of Munich, where the risk of being identified by authorities or journalists was minimal. The meetings followed specific rituals. They began with moments of silence for fallen comrades, continued with exchanges of news about imprisoned or prosecuted members, and frequently ended with collections of money to support families in difficulty or to finance legal defenses. Gudrun quickly became a respected figure within these circles, not only because she was Himmler's daughter, but because of her unwavering refusal to publicly renounce her father's memory. In a context where many former Nazis kept a low profile and avoided mentioning their past, Gudrun's ideological firmness was seen as a virtue by those who shared her perspective. At the same time, Hedwig Potthast had taken a completely different path. After her release in March 1946, she legally changed her surname to Heerwagen and settled in Schleißheim, a rural area north of Munich. Unlike Gudrun, Hedwig had no interest in preserving any memory of the regime. Her relationship with Heinrich had been transactional. She had obtained material security, comfort, and protection in exchange for giving him racially valuable children according to the criteria of the Lebensborn program. When those benefits disappeared with the collapse of the Reich, Hedwig simply closed that chapter of her life. Her children, Helga and Nanette, grew up in a modest rural environment. Hedwig told them that their father had been an officer who died in the war without specifying rank, function, or circumstances. For more than 40 years, this simplified version held. The children grew up, studied, and formed their own families, completely unaware of their biological father's true identity. The truth emerged traumatically in the 1990s when German journalists, investigating family connections of high-ranking Nazi leaders, located Helga through civil registry records that had remained sealed for decades. The name Himmler Potthast on his original birth certificate, though legally changed after the war, remained in historical documents accessible to researchers. When journalists contacted Helga in 1997, then a 55-year-old accountant living on the outskirts of Munich, the revelation left him in profound shock. According to the journalist who made the initial contact, Helga visibly paled, asked to see documentation, and then simply closed the door without saying a word. Days later, through a lawyer, he issued a brief statement. "We had no knowledge of our father's identity. We completely reject any association with his actions. We ask for respect for our privacy." Nanette, located shortly afterward working as a retired teacher in Stuttgart, reacted similarly. In one of the few public statements she would ever make, she told a local journalist, "My mother protected us from a truth that would have destroyed our childhood. Now that we know it, we can only feel shame for the blood we carry." Both siblings cut all contact with the media, refused interviews, and lived the rest of their lives in deliberate anonymity. They never established known contact with Gudrun, their half-sister, who by then was a recognized public figure in far-right circles. The fracture between the two branches of the Himmler family was absolute. While Gudrun dedicated her life to defending her father's memory, Helga and Nanette repudiated it with equal intensity. Margarete Himmler spent her final years in conditions of growing social isolation and economic decline. After temporarily losing her pension due to the 1953 reclassification, she relied on occasional assistance from former SS acquaintances and sporadic work as a seamstress. She lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Munich, furnished with a few possessions she had managed to retain from the wartime period. Neighbors who knew her during the 1960s described her as a bitter, reserved woman who avoided conversations about the past, but occasionally let slip nostalgic remarks about better times when Germany was respected. She maintained regular contact with Gudrun, who visited her weekly with her grandchildren. During those visits, according to later testimony from one of the grandchildren interviewed in 2015, Margarete spoke of Heinrich exclusively in positive terms. A man dedicated to his work, a loving father, someone misunderstood by history. Never, not even in private family conversations, did she express any doubt about the narrative of innocence she had constructed. She died in August 1967 at the age of 68. Her funeral was discreet, attended only by immediate family and a handful of former acquaintances. There were no obituaries in the German press. Gudrun kept some of her mother's personal belongings, including family photographs from the 1930s, showing the Himmler family in moments of apparent domestic normality. Heinrich playing with young Gudrun in the garden, Margarete preparing food in the kitchen of their official residence, family holidays in the Bavarian Alps. These photographs, which Gudrun would occasionally show to sympathizers in private meetings decades later, served to reinforce her narrative that her father had been a normal family man, whose memory had been distorted by Allied propaganda. The gap between this carefully curated domestic image and the documented reality of Heinrich Himmler's responsibilities in the Holocaust was never acknowledged by Gudrun. Heinrich's brothers also closed their lives without public reconciliation with the past. Gebhard Himmler, the eldest, had been classified as a Mitläufer in 1948 and was able to reintegrate into professional life as an engineer. During the 1950s, he represented a German cultural office in technical cooperation projects with Afghanistan, work he carried out with professional competence but always under a discreet profile. Colleagues who worked with him during that period described him as technically capable, personally distant, never mentioned his family. When journalists attempted to contact him in the 1960s to comment on his brother, he consistently refused any interview. He died in 1982 without ever having spoken publicly about Heinrich. His obituary in a Munich local newspaper briefly mentioned his professional career, but omitted any reference to his kinship with the Reichsführer SS. Ernst Hermann Himmler, the youngest of the three brothers, did not live to face denazification proceedings. He had been an active party member since the 1920s, working in radio propaganda structures. During the final days of the war, he was mobilized into the Volkssturm for the desperate defense of Berlin. He died on May 2, 1945, during urban combat in the Kreuzberg district as Soviet troops systematically seized each building. His body was never formally identified and was buried in one of the mass graves the Soviets dug to manage the thousands of corpses covering the capital's streets. For the family, Ernst simply disappeared in Berlin, one among hundreds of thousands of similar stories in the Reich's final chaos. Gudrun's transformation from traumatized daughter to far-right activist was gradual but inexorable. During the 1950s, her participation in veterans' meetings was largely passive, but by the early 1960s, especially after her brief tenure with the BND, she began to assume a more active role. Her role in this story does not end with the defeat of 1945. It truly begins afterward, and in the next segment we will understand why. How did Gudrun lead the secret Nazi network Stille Hilfe, helping the most wanted Nazi fugitives? Gudrun Berwitz's employment at the Bundesnachrichtendienst between 1961 and 1963 represents one of the most controversial episodes in the history of post-war German intelligence. Her hiring was neither accidental nor the result of standard recruitment procedures. Documents declassified in 2011 under pressure from the Bundestag revealed that she was recruited specifically because of her surname and her connections. The BND, the direct successor to the Gehlen organization that had operated under US supervision since 1946, employed hundreds of former SS and Gestapo members during the Cold War. The logic was pragmatic. These individuals possessed operational knowledge of Eastern Europe, spoke relevant languages, maintained contact networks in Soviet-occupied territories, and could be recruited with relative ease through a combination of legal protection and financial compensation. Gudrun was assigned to the Administrative Personnel Section in Pullach, the BND's central facilities located in a former SS complex that had been partially converted for Western intelligence use. Her official duties included managing employee files, processing security documentation and maintaining updated records of operational staff. But her real function, according to internal BND memoranda later declassified, was to serve as an informal point of contact with networks of former SS officers living under civilian identities who might possess useful information about Soviet activities in Eastern territories. An internal memorandum dated February 1962, signed by a senior BND officer, explicitly stated, "Berwitz maintains family contacts within veteran circles that may provide access to otherwise inaccessible sources. Her presence facilitates mutual trust." During her tenure, Gudrun had access to files containing the real names and current identities of former SS members working for Western intelligence under false or altered identities. This included individuals who were technically being sought by judicial authorities in other countries, but who enjoyed protection due to their operational usefulness. One of the most notable cases involved Klaus Barbie, who worked for US intelligence in Germany from 1947 until his evacuation to Bolivia in 1951 through a covert operation known as the Rat Line. The decision to employ Gudrun was made at the highest level of the BND, but implemented with strict compartmentalization. Only a small circle of senior officers knew her true identity and family connections. To the rest of the Pullach staff, she was simply Frau Berwitz, administrative secretary. That compartmentalization collapsed in 1963 when journalists from the weekly Der Spiegel, investigating the infiltration of former Nazis into intelligence services, obtained leaked documents identifying Gudrun. The publication of the article triggered a political scandal. Members of the SPD demanded an investigation. The BND director at the time defended the hiring, arguing that, during the Cold War, we could not afford to be selective about collaborators with useful knowledge, but public pressure forced her dismissal. Gudrun left Pullach in October 1963 without formal ceremony or documented employment references. Gudrun had seen firsthand how the system worked: high-quality forged documentation, secure communication channels, financial transfers that left no auditable traces, legal protection justified by arguments of intelligence utility, and evacuation to non-cooperative jurisdictions when judicial pressure became unsustainable. This operational knowledge would prove essential when Gudrun intensified her involvement with Stille Hilfe shortly after leaving the BND. Stille Hilfe für Kriegsgefangene had been officially founded in 1951 by Princess Helene Elisabeth von Isenberg, a conservative aristocrat with deep connections in German monarchist circles. She had been a sympathizer of the Nazi regime during the war, though without direct involvement in crimes. Immediately after the war, she began visiting German prisoners in Allied camps and organizing fundraising efforts for their families. In 1951, she formalized these activities by creating Stille Hilfe as a legally registered association. The declared purpose was humanitarian assistance to German prisoners and their families. In practice, the organization became a sophisticated support network for convicted war criminals and internationally wanted fugitives. Gudrun formally joined Stille Hilfe in 1964, shortly after leaving the BND. By the 1970s, she had become one of its most active and visible figures within the closed circles in which the organization operated. She did not hold an official position within the formal leadership structure, but she functioned as the de facto coordinator of multiple key activities, maintaining regular correspondence with dozens of convicted prisoners in German, Austrian, and Italian prisons, organizing discreet private fundraising events, coordinating lawyers for appeals and legal motions, and more controversially, maintaining contact with fugitives living under false identities in South America, Spain, and the Middle East. The case of Josef Mengele illustrates how the network operated. Mengele had escaped to Argentina in 1949 via the Rat Line, organized in part by sectors of the Vatican and sympathizers in Italy. He lived in Buenos Aires under a false identity for years, later relocating to Paraguay and eventually to Brazil, where he would drown in 1979. During 3 decades on the run, Mengele received regular financial support from 2 main sources: his family in Günzburg, Germany, who managed a successful agricultural machinery company, and Stille Hilfe. Letters preserved in Brazilian judicial archives after Mengele's death show that Gudrun personally signed checks sent to the Mengele family in Germany, funds that were then secretly transferred to Mengele through intermediaries. The correspondence between Gudrun and the Mengele family, partially intercepted by German intelligence services during the 1970s but not acted upon for reasons that remain unclear, used a simple yet effective code. The professor urgently needs medicine meant an immediate financial transfer was required. The aunt is ill indicated problems with authorities and the need to change communication routes. The family is asking about the uncle signaled that it was safe to establish direct contact. The code system was simple enough to be memorized without written documentation, yet ambiguous enough to maintain plausible deniability if the letters were intercepted. Walter Roff represents another paradigmatic case of how the network operated on an international scale. After the war, he escaped to Chile through contact networks in Italy and Spain. Gudrun visited Ralph personally at least twice during the 1970s, in 1972 and 1976, according to Chilean immigration records later reviewed by investigators. The visits were organized by Stille Hilfe intermediaries in Chile, primarily descendants of German immigrants with pro-Nazi sympathies. Photographs from one of these visits leaked to the Chilean press in the 1990s show Gudrun and Ralph in the garden of his residence in Las Condes, an affluent suburb of Santiago. Both appear smiling, Ralph standing beside Gudrun in a relaxed posture like old friends reunited. The image is particularly disturbing given that Ralph was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people through his technical designs of mobile gas chambers. For Gudrun, however, Ralph was not a criminal but a veteran unjustly persecuted who deserved support and solidarity. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, had been one of the most notorious beneficiaries of Western intelligence protection during the 1940s. Stille Hilfe maintained contact with Barbie throughout his time in Bolivia. Gudrun never visited him personally, but she coordinated regular transfers of funds and maintained correspondence with his wife Regine Barbie, later Wilms, who lived in Europe and occasionally visited Bolivia. When Barbie was finally extradited to France in 1983 following a regime change in Bolivia, Stille Hilfe financed his legal defense through a team of lawyers that included Jacques Vergès, the French attorney known for defending controversial causes. Erich Püppi, an SS captain, had directly participated in the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Rome on March 24, 1944. Püppi escaped to Argentina in 1948, where he lived openly in Bariloche under his real name for nearly 50 years. Stille Hilfe coordinated his legal defense during years of complex proceedings. Gudrun visited the Püppi family in Bariloche in 1995, shortly before his extradition, in a gesture of solidarity that was photographed by local journalists. During the trial in Italy, which extended until 1998 due to multiple appeals, Stille Hilfe organized fundraising campaigns in Germany to cover legal costs that exceeded hundreds of thousands of German marks. Gudrun maintained regular correspondence with him until shortly before his death. The Stille Hilfe network operated with remarkable efficiency, considering its limited resources and the need for discretion. It maintained bank accounts in multiple jurisdictions. Liechtenstein was favored for its strict banking secrecy and lack of cooperation with foreign judicial requests. Switzerland was also used, though more cautiously after the 1980s, when international pressure forced greater transparency. And paradoxically, some accounts were held in small German banks in rural areas where local managers sympathized with the cause or simply did not question the origin and destination of funds. The funds came from multiple sources, donations from sympathizers, generally elderly individuals who had served in the Wehrmacht or in the regime's administrative structures, and who felt solidarity with persecuted comrades. Private fundraising events discreetly organized in restaurants or private homes, where veterans gathered, shared memories, and contributed financially. Inheritances. Some veterans without direct descendants left part of their estates to Stille Hilfe through their wills. Researchers estimated that Stille Hilfe managed annual flows of several 100,000 German marks during its most active decades. So far, we have examined networks, decisions, and subsequent actions. But one crucial and uncomfortable piece was still missing, what Himmler himself left behind in private writing. His diaries and personal letters, introduce a level of detail that reshapes the interpretation of everything we have just seen. The hidden diaries of Heinrich Himmler, a new generation, breaks the silence. In 2014, an event shifted the public debate surrounding Heinrich Himmler and forced Gudrun, then 85 years old, to confront new documentary evidence that further complicated her narrative. A private Israeli collector, whose identity remained confidential for security reasons, revealed that he possessed more than 1,000 pages of Himmler's personal letters and private diaries written between 1934 and 1945. The documents had been acquired over decades through specialized military memorabilia auctions and had remained in a private collection without being systematically studied by historians. The collector ultimately decided to make them public after consulting with Yad Vashem and the German Historical Museum, institutions that coordinated their authentication and subsequent exhibition. The documents underwent exhaustive authentication processes for months. Handwriting experts compared the script with confirmed samples of Himmler's handwriting. Paper and ink analyses confirmed they corresponded to German manufacturing from the correct period. Specialized historians verified that events mentioned in the entries precisely matched established chronologies of Himmler's activities. The conclusion was unanimous. The documents were authentic. They were publicly exhibited for the first time at the German Historical Museum in Berlin in May 2014, generating massive international media coverage and renewed debate over the banality of evil, a concept coined decades earlier by Hannah Arendt. What made these documents particularly disturbing was not that they revealed previously unknown crimes, but the way they exposed Himmler's psychological compartmentalization. The entries alternated without apparent transition between trivial domestic concerns and administrative references to decisions that cost millions of lives. One entry dated January 20, 1942, is especially revealing. On that day, the Wannsee Conference was held in a villa on the outskirts of Berlin, where 15 senior officials of the Nazi regime formalized the bureaucratic mechanisms of the final solution, the plan to systematically exterminate Europe's Jewish population. Himmler's entry that day read verbatim, "Important meeting in Wannsee regarding security matters in Eastern territories." Heydrich presented a well-structured proposal on administrative coordination of evacuations, productive technical discussion on efficient methods and interagency coordination. All present showed understanding of the need for definitive solutions. Afterwards, extended lunch with Heydrich and Müller discussing practical implementation and timelines. Arrived home late after 9. Gudrun, still awake, asked about my trip. I explained that I had been working on important matters protecting the Reich from internal enemies. She appeared proud of my work, asked whether she might accompany me to Berlin someday to see the offices. Told her perhaps when she is older. Margarete prepared a light supper. Persistent headache, took aspirin before sleeping. On the same day that mechanisms were agreed upon to end millions of lives, Himmler wrote about ordinary domestic interactions with his teenage daughter and about his headache. For Himmler, managing extermination was part of his daily administrative work, separated from his family life when he returned home at night. Another significant entry dates from July 1942, a few weeks after the death of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague. Heydrich had been the principal operational architect of the final solution, and his death was a significant blow to Himmler both professionally and personally, as he regarded Heydrich as a protégé and close collaborator. He also wrote the following: Heydrich's funeral in Berlin, irreplaceable loss for the Reich. He was the most capable man I have known. The Führer delivered an emotional eulogy. I feel responsible for continuing his work without failure. Margarete increasingly insistent regarding the situation with Hedwig. Rumors circulating in certain social circles despite discretion. Attempted again to explain to her that having children with racially valuable women is not a personal matter but a duty toward the future of our race. As Reichsführer, I must set an example. Other leaders do the same. It is a historical responsibility. Margarete does not understand emotionally, though intellectually she accepts the logic. The situation creates unnecessary tension at home. Gudrun senses the tension but does not understand the cause. Better so for now. A third particularly significant entry dates from August 1944, when the accelerated mass deportation of Hungarian Jews sent approximately 400,000 people to Auschwitz-Birkenau within weeks through a logistical operation coordinated by Adolf Eichmann. During this same period, Himmler wrote, "Report from Eichmann on evacuations from Hungary. Operation proceeding as planned. Processing capacity at Auschwitz successfully expanded. Pohl reports that personal effects are being efficiently catalogued, recovered valuables contributing significantly to war financing. Gudrun increasingly involved in the League of German Girls, attended summer camp in Bavaria, sent enthusiastic letter describing activities. Reminds me of myself exactly at her age, with the same dedication and discipline. Will be an exemplary mother for the race in due time. She has precisely the character our nation needs. Loyal, hard-working, without unnecessary questioning. I am genuinely proud of how she is developing." Margarete also recognizes her potential. The diaries also revealed Himmler's obsession with trivial household economy. Frequent entries included complaints about expenses he considered excessive. Margarete spent 42 Reichsmarks on clothing that was not strictly necessary. I reminded her of the importance of family thrift even in our position. Gudrun must learn from a young age to manage resources responsibly. Character is formed through discipline in small matters as much as great ones. For Gudrun Berwitz, the publication of these diaries in 2014 represented a significant challenge to her carefully constructed narrative. They could not be dismissed as forced testimonies or documents falsified by the victors. In private statements afterward, she said, "The diaries prove exactly what I have always said. My father was a devoted family man who loved his children and cared about their well-being and education. The references to his work show that he, like all high-ranking officials, followed orders and managed the administrative matters assigned to him. He fulfilled his duty to Germany in extraordinarily difficult times. That Germany's enemies choose to interpret his words in a twisted way does not change the truth of who he really was, a loving father and a loyal servant of his nation." While Gudrun maintained this position, her great-niece Katrin Himmler represented the opposite pole in terms of how to process the family legacy. Katrin had been born in 1967, 2 decades after the end of the war, in a democratic West Germany where education about the Holocaust was mandatory and where historical memory had become a central component of post-war national identity. She grew up aware that her surname carried a specific historical weight, but during her youth she avoided mentioning it in new social contexts. Academically trained as a political scientist at German universities, Katrin specialized in studies of collective memory and the intergenerational transmission of trauma and historical responsibility. In 2005, she published Die Brüder Himmler, eine deutsche Familiengeschichte, The Himmler Brothers, a German family history, an exhaustively researched study tracing the parallel and divergent lives of Heinrich, Gebhard, and Ernst Himmler from their childhood in a conservative Bavarian Catholic family to their final destinies. The book was notable in the German context for several reasons. First, because Katrin did not attempt to redeem or excuse her family, but simply to understand it within its historical context. She analyzed how 3 brothers from an ordinary family, educated in traditional conservative values but without a background of extreme fanaticism, ended up on such different paths. Heinrich as the architect of the Holocaust, Gebhard as a technical official who benefited from the regime without direct participation in crimes, Ernst as a propagandist who died defending the regime in its final hours. Second, because Katrin honestly examined the complicity of broader social structures. She did not present Heinrich as an incomprehensible, aberrant monster, but as the product of a specific political culture that valued obedience over moral conscience, order over justice, and national loyalty over common humanity. When the book was published, Katrin attempted to establish contact with Gudrun. She wrote a personal letter explaining her project and requesting a meeting to discuss family memory. The letter was respectful but direct about her position. She acknowledged her pain but argued that honesty about the past was the only way to properly process the legacy. Gudrun refused to meet. Her response, sent through a lawyer to maintain distance, was brief and definitive. The person who calls herself Catherine Himmler has completely betrayed the family by publishing a book full of lies and distortions fabricated by Germany's enemies who seek to perpetuate a false narrative about the period 1933 to 1945. This person is not worthy of the surname she bears. I have nothing to say to her and no desire whatsoever for dialogue with someone who has chosen to believe enemy propaganda over family truth. Catherine responded publicly in an interview with Der Spiegel. I did not betray my biological family. I deliberately betrayed the complicit silence that allows documented mass crimes to be progressively forgotten, minimized, or actively denied for ideological convenience or misguided family loyalty. I consciously chose historical truth based on evidence over blind loyalty based on blood. That is my way of truly honoring the victims of the Nazi regime and of living with dignity while carrying this surname. I cannot change what my great-uncle did, but I can decide how I respond to that legacy in the present. The rupture between Gudrun and Catherine symbolically embodied the German generational conflict over the memory of Nazism. It was during this period of intense public debate over the diaries that Helga and Nanette Himmler, Gudrun's half-siblings, were finally located by journalists through exhaustive investigation of civil registry archives. Until then, they had lived completely anonymous lives, unaware of their true family identity. Hedwig Potthast had successfully kept the secret for more than 50 years. The revelation came in 1997 when a German investigative journalist identified the name Himmler Potthast on Helga's original birth certificate in Munich municipal archives. Although the surname had been legally changed to Heerwagen in 1946, historical records preserved the original entry. When journalists contacted Helga, then a 55-year-old retired accountant living quietly in the suburbs of Munich, the revelation devastated him. According to the journalist who made the initial contact, Helga visibly turned pale, asked to see all the documentation, read in silence for several minutes, and then simply closed the door without uttering a word. For days he did not respond to attempts at contact. Finally, through a lawyer, he issued a brief statement. My sister and I had no knowledge of the real identity of our biological father. Our mother protected us from this truth all her life. Now that we know it, we can only feel deep shame and horror at the blood we carry. We completely reject any association with the acts of Heinrich Himmler. We ask that our privacy and that of our families be respected, as they have built lives without knowledge of this historical connection. Nanette, located shortly afterward, reacted similarly. In one of the few public statements she would ever make, she said, "Our mother told us that our father was an officer who died honorably in the war. We lived 50 years believing that. To discover now that he was Heinrich Himmler is a nightmare from which we cannot awaken. We cannot change our biology, but we can completely reject that legacy. We are not responsible for crimes committed before our birth, but we are responsible for how we respond upon learning of them." Both siblings rejected all subsequent interview requests. They never appeared publicly nor established any known contact with Gudrun. When journalists asked her about the existence of her half-siblings in a telephone interview in 2001, she responded curtly, "I have no comment on that matter. My father had a complex private life." Most unsettling is that this story did not end in the archives nor with the generations who lived through the war. Decades later, when Gudrun Berwitz died, it became clear that this did not belong solely to the past. Around her funeral, names, symbols, and loyalties reappeared that many believed had vanished. And it was then that it became evident how far beyond 1945 Himmler's shadow continued to stretch. The answer lies in the next chapter. Gudrun's secret files, the Nazi legacy lives on. Gudrun Berwitz died in Munich on May 24, 2018 at the age of 88. Until her final day, she held fast to the conviction she had formed at 16, facing Allied interrogators. Her death was reported discreetly in the German press. Die Süddeutsche Zeitung published a brief obituary. Der Spiegel ran the headline, "The Last Princess of the Reich." But it was the funeral that revealed the extent to which the network she had sustained for 7 decades remained operational well into the 21st century. The ceremony was organized under strict secrecy. Only immediate family members and a closed circle of approximately 100 sympathizers were notified through a chain of personal contacts that avoided traceable phones and emails. The exact location, a crematorium on the outskirts of Munich, was kept hidden until the ceremony had concluded. Security authorities were informed 48 hours in advance. Bavarian intelligence services deployed surveillance from nearby buildings. They photographed all attendees, recorded license plates, and documented the ceremony from a distance. Among the 100 documented attendees were Udo Voigt, who had chaired the National Democratic Party from 1996 to 2011 and later served as a member of the European Parliament, and Holger Apfel, another NPD leader. Both had previously been convicted of incitement to hatred. Elderly SS veterans, some of the last surviving members of the regime, were identified discreetly wearing insignia from their former units. What followed revealed how that legacy had been transmitted within her own family. Gudrun had 2 children with Wolf-Dieter Burwitz during the 1950s, a son born in 1954 and a daughter born toward the end of the decade. Both grew up aware of their maternal grandfather's identity, but received radically different interpretations of what that identity meant. The son maintained active contact for decades with the circles his mother frequented. He lived in Rosenheim under the surname Burwitz without attempting to conceal it. In 2020, he was fined for displaying prohibited symbols during an NPD demonstration commemorating the bombing of Dresden. He attended his mother's funeral carrying a photo album containing images of Heinrich Himmler with Gudrun as a child in the 1930s. During the reception afterward, he showed the album to elderly veterans who leafed through it with nostalgia. Gudrun's daughter took a radically different path. In the 1980s, she legally changed her surname to that of her husband. She settled in Stuttgart, where she worked as an administrative assistant. She maintained minimal family contact with her mother through occasional visits, but distanced herself from any involvement in political circles. When journalists contacted her after Gudrun's death, she responded through her lawyer, "I have no comment on my family's past. I chose a different life." Her rejection was not as radical as that of Helga and Nanette, who had completely repudiated the legacy upon discovering their biological identity. But it represented a silent form of distancing through anonymity. Gudrun's great-grandchildren, born in the 1980s and 1990s, represented the 4th generation. Their paths have largely remained hidden, but in 2019, researchers monitoring neo-Nazi forums identified a user employing an alias that included 1929, Gudrun's year of birth. In leaked conversations, he mentioned a family heritage we must honor. He appeared to be a young man, approximately 25 years old, residing in Bavaria. He was never definitively identified. The fate of the files Gudrun had accumulated added a material dimension to the legacy. She had preserved letters from Heinrich written between 1935 and 1945, diaries by Margarete documenting domestic life, and correspondence between herself and war criminals from the 1960s until shortly before her death. This correspondence included letters exchanged with Josef Mengele and Walter Rauff. Other documents surfaced on the auction market. In 2020, a photograph of Heinrich with Gudrun during a visit to SS facilities in 1941 sold for €8,500. The photograph bore a handwritten inscription on the back in Gudrun's handwriting, "My father, my hero, 1965. The date revealed that 20 years after the regime's collapse, she was still making a conscious effort to preserve and venerate his memory through private acts. A handwritten letter from Heinrich to Gudrun dated 1944 appeared at auction in 2023. It sold for €11,200 to an anonymous buyer, its destination unknown. Artifacts of the regime continued to circulate in markets where some purchased them out of historical interest, while others valued them as sacred relics. Stille Hilfe continued operating without a figure comparable to Gudrun. Jens Rommel, head of the German office that investigates Nazi crimes, declared in 2022, "The networks did not disappear with Gudrun's death. They adapted. They maintained the same purpose, to deny reality, to defend the perpetrators, to perpetuate the ideology." That same year, Gudrun's grandson, who was active in neo-Nazi circles, was photographed entering a veterans meeting. He was carrying the album he had displayed at his mother's funeral. It contained images of Heinrich with the family. For him, it represented the heritage he sought to preserve. For the world, it documented complicity in crimes. 4 generations after Heinrich Himmler, the surname continued to divide those who bore it between shame and pride. The battle over memory had not ended. It had mutated into forms that reflected new contexts while preserving an unchanged core. The legacy lived on not in formal political structures, but in informal networks, family transmission, and markets where artifacts of the regime circulated as valued relics 78 years after the collapse of the Third Reich. In 2019, just 1 year after Gudrun's death, German security investigators identified an active funding network supporting extremely elderly former camp guards facing final late-stage trials. The network operated through decentralized cryptocurrencies and encrypted messaging applications that made tracking by authorities difficult. In 2021, public court records revealed that defense attorneys historically linked to Stille Hilfe were still actively defending defendants accused of Nazi crimes in contemporary European courts using sophisticated technical arguments. The basic organizational structure that Gudrun had helped sustain for decades did not die with her. It pragmatically adapted to new technologies while maintaining exactly the same fundamental ideological purpose: to preserve a selective memory of the regime, to actively deny exhaustively documented crimes, and to materially and legally support surviving perpetrators. The Himmler family remained fragmented 4 generations later. Heinrich had organized extermination while loving his daughter and calculating household budgets. Margarete had enjoyed the privileges while sustaining a narrative of ignorance that the correspondence contradicted. Gudrun had devoted 73 years to defending her father's memory, transforming filial loyalty into an ideological crusade. Hedwig had disappeared into anonymity after the collapse. Helga and Nanette had rejected the legacy upon discovering their identity. Katrin had chosen honest confrontation through historical research. Gudrun's grandchildren were divided between one who continued the activism and one who had chosen distance. The great-grandchildren were growing up in a world where Nazism was history, yet where some idealized it through narratives transmitted in private family contexts. If you enjoyed and learned from this documentary, I would appreciate it if you subscribed so you don't miss the next one.